Hello, everyone. I'm Bruna Bauer. I'm the research manager here at Pensions for Purpose. And here with me today is Sudip, who is the director of the first Sentier MUFG Sustainable Investment Institute. COP16, the Conference of Parties on Biological Diversity, also known as the Biodiversity COP, just happened in Cali, Colombia. Actually, as we record this conversation, it's the very last day of COP. And it was the first biodiversity COP since the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was a historical agreement to stop the destruction of ecosystems. This framework represents to the Biodiversity COP what the Paris Agreement represents to the Climate COP. It lists 23 targets and 4 goals to preserve nature until 2030. Governments from around 200 countries will discuss progress towards these targets, and they are also expected to present national strategies on how they plan to meet them. There is no need to say that finance plays a key role in these discussions. Financial institutions should take a special look at Target 15 of the framework, which pushes businesses and financial institutions, especially the large and international ones, to assess and disclose the biodiversity-related risks and impacts. At Pensions for Purpose, we are now just finalizing a research commissioned by the first Sentier MUFG Sustainable Investment Institute on how asset owners from all over the world are progressing when it comes to integrating nature and biodiversity into their strategies and reporting. So we thought this would be a great opportunity for us to spark more this discussion and also to bring some new insights into this conversation. So first of all, I would like to thank you, Sudip, for joining this important conversation. I would like to ask you to introduce yourself and also to address the very first question, which is, why is it essential to address climate and nature as interconnected rather than treating them as separate issues?
Well, thanks, Bruna. Yes, so I'm Sudip Hazra, Director of the Sentier MUFG Sustainable Investment Institute. And it's great to be talking to you today on the last day of COP16 on this very important topic. So, I mean, in terms of why it's essential to address climate and nature as being interconnected challenges and opportunities, I think often we see too much that they are actually treated as separate issues, when in fact, quite simply, they're not. So some of the reasons for that would be that our economy depends on natural resources and on ecosystem services, and it's nature that's providing these. And examples would be the provision of water and, of course, pollination. So we need biodiversity, which is in essence the variability amongst living organisms, and it's what enables nature to be productive, resilient, and adaptable. So an increase in biodiversity is actually what's providing us a buffer against climate impacts, and also against resilience to shocks as well. So it's nature that's providing us with, for example, effective carbon sinks, trees, mangroves, but also ocean and soil. So it plays a really central role in the ecosystem cycles, and as a result, it's really central for climate mitigation. So in a nutshell, while climate change and nature are still too often viewed as two separate issues, climate is part of nature. So they're pretty much inseparable. And in terms of the drivers of nature loss, obviously climate change is one of the key drivers, and it's also inextricably linked in cause and effect to the other drivers as well. And some examples would be, an increase in extreme stormwater events resulting in coastal erosion. But then I mentioned already pollination. So we've got the decrease in the bee population, which is partially driven by rapid climate change, and that's hampering the pollination of crops as well. So those are just two examples of how climate change can exacerbate nature loss. And in terms of kind of our audience today, obviously any declines in nature result in increases to risks for businesses and investors. And as a result, that also limits our ability to mitigate and adapt to climate change.
Mm-hmm. And what do you see as the main challenges preventing us from integrating climate and nature solutions more effectively?
So I think, two key areas would be around scale and the replicability of solutions. But then, of course, when you look at climate and nature and we want to put them in a productive bucket together, part of the issue is also very separate and different metrics, reference points, and of course, data. So although there's a lot in common, for example, location data, there's still a lot that we need to work on in order to understand the synergies. And also, I think culturally, we have some legacy issues because in general, people are more familiar and comfortable with climate work, which sometimes is taken up, the majority of space, particularly for investors around sustainability. But increasingly, I think investors and also corporates do look at how climate should not be taken in isolation. And they're also trying to understand better some of the potential trade-offs as well as the linkages. So one of the reasons for which I think we're likely to see an acceleration in investors and corporates looking at climate change and nature together is because often when we're looking at climate objectives, if nature isn't taken into account and isn't integrated properly, we are beginning to see examples of climate projects which do actually cause harm to nature because nature impacts haven't been taken into account. So I think that's an important part of the changing agenda around climate as well.
And we start discussing the economic dimension of nature and biodiversity. So I brought here some numbers around it. So ecosystem loss could reduce the global GDP by up to 2.7 trillion annually by 2030. And we still have an over 100 billion annual funding gap when it comes to nature. So during COP15, countries, which includes the UK, adopt the global biodiversity framework, committing to tackle biodiversity loss. But we're very far from hitting those targets. So my question here for you is, what are the key challenges when it comes to mobilizing finance for nature?
So that's a very big question. So I think everybody is trying to find a solution in terms of their own stakeholder interest. But I mean, broadly, I think some of the work that's come out, and I think there's been more and more research on this, is outlining some of the key areas. So I mean, from the UNEP paper, I think some of the key areas that they've highlighted are greening finance. So that would mean in practice reducing finance to nature negative finance flows. And that at the moment, I think is the majority of financing that's going on. And it's very critical to reduce the financing with negative impact. And then you've also got the positive impact side, so financing and scaling funding for investment into areas like nature-based solutions as well. And as you said, there needs to be quite an incremental increase in terms of the positive impact funding as well. But for all of that to work, I think it's quite similar to the narrative around climate financing, in that we do need a just transition around nature as well. So that means in practice a green and inclusive financial system, which takes into account the needs of the stakeholders and really answers the question in an equitable way as to how any changes will be paid for, and in particular how some of the different areas of society that are affected and impacted can participate in that change, including diverse populations and indigenous people as well.
Probably an even more important question is, what are the risks of inaction, particularly regarding the financial gap for nature, to the broader climate agenda?
I think in terms of the negative impact, that can be quite an important area to consider and a catalyst for action. I think, with the Dasgupta review, it elaborated on how large-scale and widespread investment into nature-based solutions would help us to address biodiversity loss, but also significantly contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation, not to mention the wider benefits economically, including creating jobs. So I think really some of the drawbacks of not having action include a poorer economy, missing out on quite valuable long-term job creation as well. And I think we've seen some examples of that in the US, where we've had the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, with quite specific allocations to fund conservation, restoration, resilience, national park services. And that has worked in terms of allowing new funding for quite important areas for nature development, but also in terms of job creation. So overall, I think there are examples of how that's working. But similarly, I think the more that we wait and that we don't both reduce some of the negative impact of funding and some of the environmentally harmful subsidies, the less quick any change will be, and the more visible any damage will be as well. So I think for that to work, we do need probably more understanding from all stakeholders as to how nature-based solutions can work, and how to ensure their integrity, i.e. that they're trustworthy solutions, and make sure that the kind of reporting that investors need gets to them, but also that there's a holistic approach to the impacts of some of that reporting, as I mentioned, so that we look not just at the environmental issues and consequences, but also some of the social issues and impact around nature financing in general.
Now let's talk about the impact lens research we're conducting. So for this research, we are discussing with asset owners and asset managers from all over the world. We spoke to asset owners and asset managers from over, I think, 10 countries now, to discuss their plans regarding nature and biodiversity, especially following the launch of the TNFD, so the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, last year in 2023. So I think my question is, what was the main motivation for you behind this study?
Yeah, so we're excited about the study, and we think it will be a really important piece of work, because it's a key point in time, particularly for the investment industry, because a lot of investors are right now at the early stages of their journey around biodiversity and nature. And as some context, both for Sentier investors and at MUFG, there's been a lot of focus on biodiversity. And my colleague here in the responsible investment team at Sentier, Joanne Lee, who previously worked with the WWF, developed what we call the ICAN guide. Quite rightly, that acronym sounds very optimistic and positive, but it stands for Investors Can Assess Nature Now. And it was designed very deliberately to allow institutional investors to identify and assess materiality, but also potential responses to some of the key nature biodiversity risks in portfolio companies. And the two tangible areas which she focused on were freshwater and forests, where typically there is more data available. And here at the Sustainable Investment Institute, earlier this year, we published some research on the state of nature-related disclosures by companies, where we looked at 8 priority TNFD sectors and highlighted good practice, as well as some of the trends and gaps in disclosure. So all that being said, we thought it would be a good fit to have a survey orientated around asset owners, and Pensions for Purpose have designed a research project therein with quite carefully made questions around an asset owner's approach to biodiversity, nature, and also their focus on the TNFD. And typically, we think investors right now are looking at frameworks and understanding how they work, and they want to know some of the key concepts, but also in general how the market is approaching this area. So we think it will be very useful, and hopefully it will help asset owners to be able to influence their own organizations, stakeholders, and create newer systems for action on biodiversity and nature, but also hopefully it will have some practical outcomes in allowing the readers of this study to be able to get some insight into the state of asset owner approaches, and also potentially to be able to prioritize particular areas and maybe get some ideas around some of the approaches that are out there already.
Mm-hmm. And now a very, very important question, which based on the very early findings of our research, we see that that's a challenge for asset owners from all over the world. So Deep, what are the first steps that you think pension funds can take to include nature and biodiversity into their broader ESG considerations?
So I think that's, again, it's a very big question, and it will depend a lot, of course, on the type of asset owner and the beneficiary base. And typically, I mean, there are three main areas that asset owners that we've seen are working on. First of all, it's the investment process. So that would include things like biodiversity policy and strategy, as well as the incorporation generally into investment methodology and outlook. Then there's the stewardship angle, so portfolios and assessing companies, as well as looking at and encouraging collaborative engagement. And this can also include policy level engagement, both globally and at a national level. And then finally, there's the disclosure angle, so obviously aligning with framework recommendations and implementing best practice. But really, I think, I mean, as a first step, perhaps just understanding the value of initiating this process for an asset owner, and also the relevance to their own stakeholders and beneficiaries. I think having that as a first step can facilitate a lot of the other areas that I've just spoken about. So that's probably one of the areas to consider as well.
Mm-hmm. So Deep, thank you very much. As I mentioned, the TNFD has just been recently launched. So we've now spoken to over 20 asset owners and asset managers, and we do see that everyone is at very early stages of thinking of nature and biodiversity, and especially reporting on those topics. So in this report, we're really going to take the opportunity to highlight some best practice, because we really want the industry to learn how to move forward and to learn from best practice as well. So we've been speaking to asset owners from all over, and we really think that this report is an opportunity for us to learn from each other and exchange knowledge, which is so important since we're at very early stages of these considerations. So the report is going to be published at the end of January next year, and we invite you all to read and to exchange with us as well. Thank you very much, Sudi, for your time, and see you on February when you're going to have the online roundtable discussion to discuss and debate the findings of this research. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruna. It's been great talking to you today.